It was April 2nd, 1917. Inside the grand chamber of the U.S. Capitol, every breath felt heavier than history itself. President Woodrow Wilson stood before Congress, his voice low but unwavering, as he uttered a sentence that would echo across the 20th century. The world must be made safe for democracy. With those 12 words, the former university professor from Princeton, once an idealist who vowed to keep America out of Europe's war, dragged an entire nation onto the global stage. Only 4 years earlier, Wilson had campaigned on the promise of neutrality. "He kept us out of war," his supporters chanted in 1916. Yet beneath the surface, German U-boats prowled the Atlantic, sinking American ships. The infamous Zimmermann telegram exposed a secret German plan to enlist Mexico against the United States. The public's faith in isolation began to crack. Wilson, torn between his pacifist conscience and his sense of moral duty, watched the old world burn and wondered whether a new world power could truly remain untouched. That spring day, his decision shattered a century of American detachment. The Senate roared in approval. Newspapers across the nation hailed a crusade for liberty. For the first time in history, the United States was not merely defending its borders, it was entering a war to defend an idea. But Wilson's crusade did not end with victory on the battlefield. When the cannons fell silent in 1918, he envisioned something even greater, a League of Nations that would prevent all future wars, a brotherhood of governments bound by law rather than greed. He believed humanity had finally learned its lesson. History, however, would prove less obedient. Wilson's dream of eternal peace ignited both admiration and resentment, an audacious blueprint for American moral leadership that many hailed as visionary and others condemned as naive. The question that would haunt the century was born that day in 1917. Did Woodrow Wilson save democracy, or did he awaken the age of American intervention? Woodrow Wilson's presidency marked the precise moment when America's moral compass collided with its global destiny. Between 1913 and 1921, he transformed the United States from an isolated republic into a self-proclaimed guardian of democracy, a shift that forever altered the nation's relationship with the world. His decision to lead America into World War I was not simply a military maneuver, it was a philosophical leap. He believed that power should serve principle, that the world could be governed by ideals rather than empires. Yet that same conviction would divide his country. The League of Nations, Wilson's visionary plan to prevent future wars, was hailed abroad as the dawn of a new international order, but rejected at home as an assault on national sovereignty. In the end, the man who fought to make peace universal could not persuade his own Congress to join it. Wilson's legacy, therefore, is not just about war or peace. It is about a turning point, when the United States first confronted the paradox of global leadership. How to defend democracy without becoming its enforcer. Thomas Woodrow Wilson was born in 1856 in Staunton, Virginia, into a world already fractured by the tensions that would soon erupt into the American Civil War. His father, Joseph Ruggles Wilson, was a Presbyterian minister who preached fiery sermons in defense of the Confederate cause, while his mother, Jessie, quietly nurtured in him a moral seriousness that would later define his politics. The boy grew up surrounded by sermons, debates, and the scars of war, an environment that would ingrain in him an obsession with righteousness and order. Wilson did not learn to read until the age of 10, yet once he did, words became his weapon. He devoured history and law, not for entertainment, but to understand how ideas could govern nations. After earning degrees from Princeton and the University of Virginia Law School, and later a PhD from Johns Hopkins, the only U.S. president to hold one, Wilson's academic mind took shape around one grand conviction: society could be improved through structure, discipline, and moral leadership. As a professor and later the president of Princeton University, Wilson was no mere administrator. He was a reformer obsessed with shaping character. He restructured curricula, demanded ethical rigor, and believed education should train men not only to think but to serve. Beneath his academic calm lay a preacher's soul. He saw moral purpose where others saw pragmatism. By the time he entered politics, first as governor of New Jersey in 1911, Wilson had already crafted a distinct vision, a synthesis of Southern moralism, Northern progressivism, and academic idealism. He believed government existed not just to manage society, but to uplift it. His early reforms in New Jersey, Attacking political corruption, expanding labor rights, and regulating monopolies earned him national attention. But his moral compass, so rigid and absolute, was both his greatest strength and his looming weakness. Wilson saw compromise not as a tool, but as a betrayal of truth. When he spoke of morality, he did so with the authority of a man who believed he understood it better than most. That sense of divine conviction would later drive his most audacious acts and his most tragic downfalls. When Woodrow Wilson stepped into national politics, he was an outsider, a scholar among career politicians, a man who quoted Aristotle more often than he shook hands. Yet, within a few short years, he mastered the machinery of American power with a precision that shocked even his adversaries. His rise was as methodical as it was improbable. After winning the governorship of New Jersey in 1910, Wilson's reform agenda, targeting corrupt party bosses and pushing progressive labor laws, caught the attention of national reformers hungry for honesty in politics. His unbending moralism made him appear incorruptible. His eloquence made him electable. By 1912, amid the split between Theodore Roosevelt's Progressive Party and the Republicans, the Democrats saw in Wilson a man of destiny. And he won the presidency with just 42% of the popular vote. As president, Wilson envisioned himself less as a politician and more as a teacher of the nation. He held weekly press briefings, spoke directly to Congress, reviving a practice dormant since the 18th century, and treated legislation like a moral syllabus. His New Freedom program aimed to dismantle corporate monopolies, reform banking, and expand opportunities for ordinary Americans. The creation of the Federal Reserve System and the Federal Trade Commission under his leadership redefined the American economy for decades to come. But Wilson's most remarkable transformation occurred in his view of America's place in the world. At first, he clung to neutrality. He believed the United States should lead by example, not by arms, a city upon a hill untouched by the chaos of Europe. Yet even as he preached restraint, he quietly exercised power abroad, dispatching troops to Mexico, Haiti, and the Dominican Republic. His foreign policy, cloaked in idealism, was in fact a prelude to interventionism. By 1916, Wilson's re-election campaign slogan, "He kept us out of war," resonated with a war-weary public. But behind the scenes, the global order was collapsing. German submarines were sinking American vessels, European empires were bleeding themselves dry, and the old world was crumbling under the weight of industrial slaughter. Wilson sensed a calling larger than politics. He began to speak not of strategy, but of morality, not of victory, but of justice. When he finally asked Congress to declare war in 1917, it was not with the language of generals, but of prophets. He did not promise conquest. He promised redemption. And with that, the Professor President transformed the United States from a cautious republic into a missionary empire, convinced that by entering the war, America was not merely fighting Germany, but fighting for the soul of mankind. The spring of 1917 marked one of the most decisive pivots in American history. As German U-boats sank the Lusitania and other neutral ships without warning, as Europe drowned in blood and smoke, President Woodrow Wilson's neutrality cracked under the moral weight of his own ideals. The infamous Zimmermann telegram, in which Germany invited Mexico to join an anti-American alliance, was the final insult. The Old World's War had reached America's doorstep. When Wilson stood before Congress on April 2, 1917, to ask for a declaration of war, he did not speak as a warrior, but as a preacher. The world must be made safe for democracy, he declared. Its peace must be planted upon the tested foundations of political liberty. Those words were not crafted for applause. They were the articulation of a philosophy. To Wilson, this was not a war of nations, but of civilizations, a moral crusade to end all wars. Congress approved his request 4 days later. America was at war. At first, the United States was unprepared for the scale of the conflict. Its army was small, its navy overstretched, and its industrial machine still converting from peace to war. But within a year, America transformed itself. The Selective Service Act mobilized millions of men, women entered the workforce in record numbers, and the propaganda machine, led by George Creel's Committee on Public Information, turned the war into a sacred duty. Posters, films, and songs painted the fight as a holy cause, the triumph of light over darkness. Wilson wielded language as deftly as armies. His public addresses linked the fight in Europe to the moral fabric of democracy itself. Yet behind the noble rhetoric, contradictions festered. While America fought abroad for freedom, dissent at home was silenced. The Espionage Act, 1917, and the Sedition Act, 1918, criminalized criticism of the war, jailing journalists, activists, and ordinary citizens. The same man who dreamed of liberating the world also oversaw one of the harshest crackdowns on free speech in U.S. history. Meanwhile, on the front lines, the arrival of American troops shifted the balance. Under General John J. Pershing, the American Expeditionary Forces tipped the scales at battles like Cantigny and the Meuse-Argonne Offensive. The fresh, idealistic soldiers Wilson sent into the trenches became the decisive force that broke Germany's will. By November 11, 1918, the guns finally fell silent. Europe was devastated, entire cities reduced to ash, an entire generation buried in mud. Wilson was hailed as a savior. Crowds in Paris and London shouted his name, waving American flags. For a brief moment, it seemed the United States had not only won the war, but had also conquered the moral imagination of the world. And Wilson believed the victory meant something larger than peace. He envisioned a new world order, one governed by reason, law, and mutual respect, where nations would no longer fight but deliberate. His 14 points, announced in January 1918, laid out this vision: open diplomacy, self-determination, free trade, and a global covenant to preserve peace. The 14th point, the creation of a general association of nations, would become the cornerstone of his dream, the League of Nations. Yet even as Wilson prepared to cross the Atlantic to shape the post-war peace, critics at home stirred. Isolationists saw his plans as dangerous idealism. Senators bristled at the thought of surrendering U.S. sovereignty to an international body. Wilson dismissed them. He believed history would vindicate him, that humanity had reached a turning point and he was its chosen messenger. The war had made him a prophet. But prophets, as history would soon remind him, often die unheard. In January 1919, Woodrow Wilson arrived in Paris not as a politician but as a messiah. To the exhausted nations of Europe, he embodied moral salvation, the American president who had promised peace without victory. Crowds cheered his motorcade as if witnessing the dawn of a new age. Yet inside the gilded halls of the Paris Peace Conference, Wilson faced an arena ruled not by ideals but by vengeance. At the negotiating table sat three men who saw the world very differently: British Prime Minister David Lloyd George, French Premier Georges Clemenceau, and Italian leader Vittorio Orlando. Wilson spoke of disarmament, self-determination, and a League of Nations that would safeguard collective peace. Clemenceau, hardened by the devastation of northern France, wanted Germany punished, crippled, humiliated. Lloyd George sought imperial advantage. Orlando demanded territory. Wilson's idealism met the raw calculus of power, and it began to bend. He fought for the soul of his vision. Over 6 months of negotiations, Wilson compromised again and again to preserve the League. He accepted harsh reparations against Germany, redrawn borders, and secret treaties he once condemned. He told himself these were necessary sacrifices. But each concession chipped away at the purity of his promise. When the Treaty of Versailles was finally signed in June 1919, Wilson saw it as a flawed but necessary foundation for peace. The League of Nations, his creation, stood at the treaty's heart. He believed the League would correct any injustice that lingered in the text. The Covenant, he said, is the compact of civilization. Back home, however, America saw something very different. Senators, led by Henry Cabot Lodge, denounced the League as a betrayal of the Constitution. They argued it would drag the United States into endless European conflicts. The same nation that had rallied behind Wilson's crusade for democracy now recoiled from the world he wanted to build. Isolationist sentiment surged. Newspapers mocked the professor's dream. Wilson, unwilling to compromise, embarked on a grueling nationwide train tour to rally public support. He spoke in city after city, his body breaking under the strain. In September 1919, in Pueblo, Colorado, his voice trembled with desperation. "Shall we break the heart of the world?" Days later, he collapsed from a massive stroke that left him partially paralyzed. While Wilson lay in the White House, half conscious, his wife Edith secretly managed presidential affairs. The Senate rejected the Treaty of Versailles. The United States never joined the League of Nations, the very institution Wilson had sacrificed everything to create. In the end, his greatest triumph became his greatest tragedy. A vision too far ahead of its time, undone by the very democracy he sought to uplift. The League limped on without America, unable to prevent future conflicts. 2 decades later, as the world plunged once more into war, history seemed to whisper its cruel verdict: that Wilson had been right about humanity's hope, but wrong about its readiness. The myth of Woodrow Wilson as the saint of democracy began to fracture even before his presidency ended. Behind the grand rhetoric of idealism lay contradictions that would haunt his legacy long after the cannons of World War I fell silent. For a man who spoke so often of freedom, Wilson's America was a paradox: progressive abroad, repressive at home. During the war, his administration crushed dissent with ruthless precision. The Espionage and Sedition Acts turned patriotism into law enforcement. Newspapers were censored, labor strikes suppressed, and activists like Eugene V. Debs imprisoned for speaking against the war. Wilson, the scholar president who believed words could redeem nations, now punished them as threats. His government deported radicals in the infamous Palmer raids, setting a precedent for political surveillance that would echo through future decades. Then there was race, the moral stain that his eloquence could not conceal. Wilson's administration resegregated federal offices, demoting and firing black civil servants who had served since Reconstruction. In 1915, he screened The Birth of a Nation in the White House, a film glorifying the Ku Klux Klan, and reportedly called it like writing history with lightning. Whether or not he fully grasped its consequences, his inaction emboldened white supremacist movements nationwide. Critics also accused him of hypocrisy abroad. While he preached self-determination in Europe, he tolerated imperial interventions in Latin America. U.S. Marines occupied Haiti and the Dominican Republic under his watch, occupations justified under the rhetoric of stability, but experienced by locals as domination. His promise of universal liberty, it seemed, came with boundaries. Even his allies began to waver. Progressive intellectuals who once revered him as the conscience of democracy turned away in disappointment. Walter Lippmann called him a good man lost in illusion. H.L. Mencken was harsher, dismissing him as the most dangerous idealist to enter politics. And yet, for all his flaws, Wilson remained tragically human, a man whose intellect outpaced the world he governed, whose faith in moral reason collided with the machinery of politics. His contradictions were not the product of malice, but of belief, the belief that truth, once spoken, could bend history. History would prove him half right. When Woodrow Wilson left the White House in 1921, carried out by illness and political defeat, he was a shadow of the man who had once commanded nations with words. The League of Nations, his proudest creation, stood, but without America, its moral spine was broken. He spent his final years secluded in his Washington home, too weak to speak for long, yet still believing that someday the world would understand what he tried to build. Time, however, would not grant him easy vindication. The 1920s saw America retreat into isolation once more. Congress slashed immigration, rejected foreign entanglements, and raised tariffs. The dream of an international order rooted in justice faded beneath the noise of prosperity and indifference. When Wilson died in 1924, few politicians attended his funeral. Yet in foreign capitals, London, Paris, Geneva, diplomats still whispered his name with reverence and doubt. It was only decades later, after World War II, that the magnitude of Wilson's vision came into focus. Franklin D. Roosevelt's formation of the United Nations in 1945 echoed Wilson's League almost word for word. The principle of collective security, the idea that peace could be maintained by cooperation rather than conquest, these were Wilson's children reborn. The same ideals that had failed him in 1919 became the bedrock of global diplomacy after 1945. But his legacy is not one of triumph alone. Wilson's presidency left a scar, a reminder of how ideals can blind as much as they inspire. His moral certainty justified censorship, racial segregation, and interventionism. He proved that good intentions, untempered by empathy or humility, can sow as much discord as any weapon. Today, historians see him neither as saint nor villain, but as a hinge of history, the man who dragged America into modernity, teaching it the dangerous art of leading the world. His story warns that every idealist who wields power must one day answer to the consequences of his faith. Woodrow Wilson believed that reason could save humanity. History, in turn, taught that humanity needs more than reason. It needs restraint. In the twilight of his life, Woodrow Wilson watched from a dimly lit room as the world he had tried to reshape drifted back toward chaos. The professor who once believed he could teach humanity to be moral found himself a patient of history, broken, sidelined, and half forgotten. Yet even as his body failed, his conviction never did. "I have seen the future," he whispered to a visitor not long before his death, "and it is worth the fight." A century later, the world still wrestles with Wilson's paradox. His vision of a democratic world order remains the compass of American foreign policy, but his missteps remind us that moral certainty can be as dangerous as moral absence. He taught America that ideals, once released into the bloodstream of politics, can never be contained. They inspire, they divide, they transform. President since Wilson has carried a piece of his ghost: Roosevelt's United Nations, Kennedy's call to defend freedom in any corner of the globe, Bush's rhetoric of spreading democracy. Each, in his own way, has tried to finish Wilson's crusade, or to undo it. Perhaps that is his true legacy. Not the League of Nations, not even his Nobel Peace Prize, but the eternal argument he began. The question of how far America should go in shaping the world in its image. Wilson's life ended in silence, but his idea never did. It continues to echo through every intervention, every peace summit, every promise that America makes to the world. That power, if guided by virtue, can make the world safe for democracy. But history still asks, softly, insistently, at what cost?